All right. Well, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. I'm joined by Dr. Jessica Gall Myrick, who is a professor of communications at Penn State University. Her research focuses on media processes and effects related to emotions and beneficial outcomes, such as improved health behaviors, decreased stigma towards outgroups, and increased civic engagement with environmental issues. Lastly, she is also the author of various publications. So, Jessica, thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure.
So, how did you first get interested in researching media?
Well, I actually used to be a journalist. I got my master's in journalism and did a lot of magazine writing, but I also worked for public television and public radio. And I became really intrigued with what types of stories got more clicks. Or when I would go to the grocery store, people would want to talk about the story that had a dog in it, or the story about how all the local chefs use different parts of a single pig. And maybe were less interested or didn't remark to me about the policy stories. And so I got really interested in how people are attracted to different types of media and how we can maybe improve media or find ways to get people's attention on important issues, but also on things like health and healthcare policy and the environment. So it grew out of I've always been interested. I guess my biggest news influence was my grandma. She lived with us and we'd always watch the evening news. And so that drew me to journalism, and that drew me to eventually to media psychology.
Yeah, okay. So I'm sure then, over the course of your career, when you're going from, journalism to just researching as a professor, social media has evolved quite a bit over time. So I'm sure that's a something that has really been an interesting process to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. I started my graduate master's program in journalism in 2006, and right around the time when social media companies were really taking off, and there was this great fear that they would kill journalism, that literally that all
Okay.
the newspapers would fold. And obviously that's not happened, but has definitely changed
Sure.
both journalism and how we get our all sorts of information and how we get our entertainment. And then I worked for a while before I went back to get my PhD and become a researcher. And at that point, I remember there were some faculty at my doctoral institution who were just like, I'm done. I don't want to learn about social media. Like, I'm retiring instead of
Yeah.
studying this. So it has been a really interesting, but also really challenging time to try to grasp the nuanced and different ways in which both traditional media and social media and their interplay affect us.
Yeah. So you just kind of bridge the gap between eras then of media
Yeah,
production.
I'm technically an elder millennial
Okay.
age-wise, so I guess that's just been my lot in life as I bridge gaps.
Just on the edge. I guess I'm the
Yeah.
same. I guess I'm technically, so I was born in 94. So I'm technically like at the very, like the last millennial possible kind of. So I
Yeah,
think
yeah, you're the
93, it's
opposite end.
then next
Yeah.
generation. So,
Yeah,
or 90, yeah, five.
yeah.
But yeah, so that's interesting. So how would you say then social media had like as impacts our emotions as people then when you're studying this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and in a lot of different ways. One of the main ways is we can spend more time with media, not just because of social media, but because of the internet and Wi-Fi and our smartphones, and so that intersection between mobility of media and then the constant updates, and it's actually a really hard topic to talk about when when you a researcher, you're always looking at these nuances, and it's hard to boil them down. And media and emotions are both such a big topic, but for a lot of people, they become very anxious now when they don't have access to media and new information or to other people. And there have been a lot of good studies where researchers take people's phones away,
Oh
and
gosh.
blood pressure spikes, heart rate
Yep.
spikes.
Yep.
People show all sorts of other signs of anxiety. So even we are so connected to media technology and media messages now that their absence even triggers an emotion. And then as far as the actual content itself, it really depends on what type of content you're following and how you set up what we call your media diet. And there's a lot of what we call doom scrolling now, where you
Okay.
kind of get literally addicted to the negative emotions brought to you by, depressing headlines and war and crime and social divides. But once you get used to getting that sort of information, it's really hard to stop going to it. And your brain automatically associates, let's say Twitter, if that's the social media app you use to get your news, associates it with that type of emotion. And so if you're feeling really bored, you might automatically just open Twitter because you're wanting to come, your brain is wanting a little hit basically of something that's arousing, something that gets the juices flowing. So for a lot of people, they use different types of social media for different functions. The more visual types of social media, like let's say Instagram, some people just follow puppies on it and
Yep.
close friends. So you can researchers have found that people use different social media apps and platforms, often subconsciously. They don't realize they've done this, but they serve different emotional functions, depending on if you're bored or overstimulated, if you need to commiserate with other people who also feel bad or depressed or anxious about something, or if you need social support,
Right.
or if you need a joke. You can follow any Reddit thread. Reddit is a very text-based social media, but also has a lot of memes, and there are gender differences. Men tend to use Reddit more than women, for instance. Women tend to use Instagram more than not. So there are sort of groups and cultures that develop around different media apps. And the question is chicken or the egg, because we've always needed other people. We've always been really social animals. And
Yeah,
we've always
definitely.
looked at other people to help us meet our emotional needs, but to help us gauge what are the emotions of my society and my culture. Are we, is this a joyous time? So I'm in Pennsylvania right now, and I've been walking around campus and I see all these people wearing Philadelphia Eagles gear
Yeah.
because
That's right.
the Eagles just, made it to the Super Bowl. So there's a lot of, and you can get that from social media too. You can see everybody, posting their selfies or whatnot with their Eagles jerseys. So it's different in that we have constant access to it and to lots more people than we would see in daily life. Um, but it's also still a reflection of our previous emotional lives before social
Yeah,
media.
definitely. I mean, I guess one interesting aspect that's kind of developed as a result of sort of the modern version of social media is like influencer culture. So I know there's
Mhm.
always been influencers, but now there's just kind of everywhere on your phone. And since people use their phones all the time, as you're talking about,
Yeah.
you're seeing them much more than just, maybe a billboard that you happen to come across while walking home from work, or seeing a commercial on TV or something with a celebrity you recognize. But now it's like these people are everywhere popping up on your phone. How does modern day social media and the role of influencers and their followers, how does that impact the mental health of people who are both someone being an influencer and someone being someone who's like a fan of this influencer?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right that we've always had influencers. And in fact, early research on media effects was done in the 1940s, and they wanted to see how news media affected people's voting decisions.
Okay, yeah.
And they actually went around and interviewed people. Did you watch the news? Did that change your vote? And most people said, no, I didn't change my vote. And their initial conclusion was that, oh, the media don't affect people's voting decisions. And they did follow-up studies and they found out, oh, actually, there's what we call a two-step flow. And the
Yeah.
media were influencing opinion leaders, as what those
Okay.
researchers called it. And then the opinion leaders in town were talking to other people about what they had heard in the news, and then that was influencing their vote. So it was really, Aunt Dorothy down the street or so and so's neighbor's dad that was influencing them, but they were reciting facts or rumors or
Yep,
whatever they
that's
had
right.
heard
Yeah.
on the radio or in the newspapers at the time. So it's interesting to know that history of understanding that media influence is often shaped through the particular people that we trust and that we know or that we're drawn to, who are charismatic. And so, but now social media is making that a business of in and of its own. I have students here who want to be influencers in
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
particular areas and they're really interested in understanding media psychology because they want more people to click on their sponsored posts and to follow them and interact with them. So I have I work with a graduate student, in fact, who is a little bit of a social media influencer herself, and she's doing her entire dissertation on the mental health of influencers, and it
Mm.
It's the early, indications and existing work is that it is really hard on their mental health, because even if you think of it as a job, you're constantly getting comments and a lot of them aren't pleasant.
No, that's right. It's a mixed
And
bag.
yeah, and so if
Yeah.
you think of other business people, they usually have a layer between themselves, their own identity, and
Yep.
the product they're selling, but there's not that layer in between, and it's hard to tell how much other people who follow you are being influenced by these negative comments. So there's a lot of layers in there. Now, as far as general users who are not influencers, how does social media impact their mental health? This is a really big topic of research, and um, one of the most thorough studies and groups of studies have found that it's not a lot for the average person. About 80% of people aren't really positively or negatively affected, as far as their self-esteem,
Okay.
by social media, but there's sort of the 10% on each end that do tend to be, negatively affected, and then some who are really positively affected. They get a self-esteem boost, from having social support or friends, and then there are other people who are, the social comparison aspect or
Yeah.
even cyberbullying contributes to that. So, it really it depends on the type of person, and this is also not a terribly new, concept in the field of media psychology. There's been lots of debates about how violence and sex in the media, affect people, and what most of the research shows about, movie and television violence is that most people it does nothing to.
Sure. Sure.
As far as, like, are they actually going to become more aggressive? But there are a few people, different backgrounds, developmental considerations, who it can be triggering. But for most people, it just makes them a little bit more scared of
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
people. It doesn't make them violent. So in the differences with social media is that it often is interactive, and there are concerns about cyberbullying, but that active interactivity, media research shows, can make the content feel more realistic, more personal, and sometimes that can be really good. People used to make fun of meeting romantic partners online, of online dating, and now it's like sort of generally accepted because people realized,
Yeah.
oh, you actually can
Yeah.
form relationships with people over the internet, or over apps, or meet them over apps. So there are a lot of ways it can actually connect people better than we realized 10, 15, 20 years ago. And when you're connecting with good people or good causes or good for you causes, then that's great. But if it starts to get vitriolic, or you don't keep a careful eye on how much time you're spending or how you're getting sucked into different things, then it could be problematic.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many interesting aspects of that when like following people, and I guess when it comes to the 10% that are like really locked into it, I wonder how much does that 10% impact like general culture, and maybe people become impacted by influencers without even realizing it, just because there's that 10% that are like diehard into it that then shape their lives based on sort of what they're being influenced by influencers, which kind of spreads almost across society that may not be on social media or pay much attention to it. As you were kind of talking about with the news, how people get their news. Um,
Mhm.
it's interesting to see all those factors at play. How concerned, are you about like how people form these kind of parasocial relationships with influencers where they feel like they know them? Because as you mentioned, this is a much more personal sort of platform now with social media and getting stuff directly from that person that you look up to. And we've always kind of had these there's the guy who's watching sports, watching his favorite football team, is like worshiping them and the players. Or you have like the person who's looking up to this model or something like that on Instagram. So what do you make of that today, and your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're right that we've since we've had media, people have formed parasocial relationships with media figures. And the early research on parasocial relationships was actually with news anchors.
Okay. Yeah.
And it was researchers noticing that viewers would say goodnight or respond to the anchor when at the time there were only male
Yeah.
anchors, they would say goodnight and people would reply back. So it's
Right.
this described as this one-sided relationship where the audience feels like they're in a relationship, but obviously the media figure doesn't really know. And I think that has really shifted in the social media era because sometimes people do reply or their publicist is replying or someone they've
Yeah.
hired.
Yep.
And so it feels more like a two-sided, even if it is still really one-sided. And so yeah, it can be harnessed for good. A lot of my research has looked at when celebrities announce they have an illness, how that motivates people to consider their own health behaviors and to consider donating or
Okay.
performing screening behaviors. So even when Mary Tyler Moore died, those her, you know, previous generation, she was such a central figure. She'd always been a diabetes activist. And we found that people who watched a lot of the nostalgic coverage of her death were more willing to donate to
Oh, okay.
diabetes
Yeah.
related charities. So, and then there's a whole line of research pre-social media about when Magic Johnson announced he was HIV positive,
Yep.
that people who really identified with him and who consumed a lot of news and basketball were more likely to re-examine their own sexual behaviors and consider HIV testing. So it can have really powerful beneficial effects, but if you have celebrities or influencers who are conspiracy theorists, it can
Yes.
really go the other way and have negative consequences for society. And there have been a lot of, I've done other research where we sort of we made mock like People magazine websites, and when celebrities endorse fad diets, like
Oh gosh. Yeah.
it's
That's
not
pretty
it's
common.
not too
Yeah.
surprising that that
Yeah.
might influence some people, but it's a subtle process whereby people are like, oh well, maybe this isn't as weird as I thought it was. And
Yeah. Yeah.
especially when you're hit with this time after time after time, then it starts to become accepted. So none of us are immune from it. We like to think that we're
Sure.
all really reasonable and we are never affected by pressure or advertising or what a celebrity says, but that's not true because humans are social animals and we're heavily influenced by other people. And whether you'll admit it or not, celebrities and influencers have cultural status,
Oh
and so
yeah.
they get our
Yeah.
attention faster than others do. And our brains, literally, there have been studies like brain imaging studies, fMRI. Like we just pay more attention to celebrities whether we say we like them or not. So, and that's it's the way that our culture society organizes itself. So it with social media, and you can follow every step in it, and a lot of celebrities and influencers are so carefully putting out the content, they don't have to depend on a journalist to mediate between you and them. They can really carefully craft the type of information they give you. It would behoove all of us to think about it and to just understand that this is probably the most, even though it seems like the most raw, unfiltered access you've been given, it's the most strategic access you've ever been given, the most carefully planned access into making them feel like a friend, even when they're shown to be imperfect on their own social media feeds. That's on purpose to seem more
Yeah.
authentic, which is one of the best ways to gain trust. So I'm not saying we should all be negative and skeptical all the time,
Right.
far from it, but to keep that in mind when you're
Yeah.
thinking about, oh well, this influencer bought this type of collagen coffee creamer, maybe I really need the collagen coffee creamer. Well, maybe you don't. It's just that you really like that person. Maybe you should actually ask a doctor.
Yeah, I mean, it is a little scary at times to think about, like, how much trust people can put into just some person they actually don't really know, but they feel they know online. And I guess we kind of saw that with like cryptocurrencies. A lot of celebrities are jumping in on that, and obviously more people who invest, the more money they make. And so it's an interesting thing to see. I guess a few questions then come to my mind about this, because I guess the first thing is just like, people have this tendency to kind of live vicariously through a celebrity or a professional athlete, or in this, I guess today now, like these influencers, that show off these lavish lifestyles and doing all these cool things. Um, to what extent does social media, given its prevalence in society, kind of make people do less for themselves in terms of improving their own life and trying to chase after a dream, but instead settle for just kind of like looking at someone else's life and thinking, well, I'll never be that person, but this person's awesome, and so I'm just going to follow them. Because I've always just kind of wondered, what's that dynamic for people when it comes to pursuing their own careers. Maybe if you see someone that's like a motivational speaker influencer, that might be someone that will propel you to want to do something more with your life. But I also feel like there might be an aspect where it's just kind of, oh, I like this person so much because I won't be this person. And I want to be this person, but I can't, or something.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think we know 100% for sure. But you talked about sports, and that's actually a great example in 2017. Well, in the late 20 teens, I'm now getting my years mixed up because COVID has wiped my
Yeah.
sense of time.
Yeah.
But a US woman, Shalane Flanagan, won the New York City Marathon. And it was the first time in 40 years that a US woman had won. And her Instagram following went pew, way up. She was already a Nike sponsored athlete, so pretty well known in the running world, but people started
Right.
following her. And then the next fall, another US woman, Des Linden, won the Boston Marathon. Her following went up. And what happened was that women's entrance in marathons across the US went up.
Oh, wow. Okay.
More women started running marathons, and also from the elite women, they started running a lot faster. And it
Hmm.
wasn't like all the elite US women, started drinking some special green juice. It was literally just sort of this wave of having more insight into what they did and how they did it through their social media feeds. And people thinking, wow, if they can do it, I can do this too. And
Yeah.
it seemed to really inspire a lot of people. Of course, that's an anecdote, but because I think your question is such a good one, and it's one we really need like a bunch of sociologists to try to
Yeah.
um to 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 figure out. And I think and it's probably compounded too by the pandemic, because we could only live through other people's social media feeds
Yes. Yes.
through the pandemic. There were a lot of things that just weren't there. Road races were canceled to continue the the marathoning example. There were just a lot of things that weren't happening, vacations, conferences, family gatherings. So I think maybe people got used to it. And maybe
Yeah.
now there's a little less conversion between, well, I'm inspired and I'm going to do something. But it makes a lot of, what's amazing about the internet is it makes a lot of niche areas really available
That's
to
true.
anyone,
Yeah.
anytime. And that weren't, previously. The explosion of podcasts, for example, about all
Yes. That's
sorts
right.
of different topics. And so, I think there's you can find community, and perhaps even to use your example of sort of living vicariously, but you can find more examples of who to live vicariously through, when perhaps
Hmm.
before, with just mainstream media, there were only sports stars and movie stars and
Yep. That's right.
politicians. Like now you can find examples of people who quit their job and opened a tattoo parlor and coffee shop. And so there are actually more examples where people can do what behavioral psychologists call social learning, and modeling, in the sense of doing what someone else is doing or thinking about doing what someone else is doing. So, and then just from a representational standpoint, there's a lot more diversity out there. You can find an influencer of any, type of background and skin color and life experience and sexuality. And so, that can be really motivating to people who maybe only saw like mainstream
Yeah.
examples of people to identify with before. So it has so much good possibilities. Now,
Yeah.
a lot of my colleagues study the negative and the way, I studied how people used COVID-19 memes on the internet to help them cope with the stress of living through the pandemic. Well, a lot of conspiracy theorists use memes to get their point across in really
Yep.
effective, visual, memorable ways, and a lot of anti-government movements and other things, violent movements use memes too. So it cuts both ways, and I think we as individuals and as a society need to think about both of these, good and bad
Yeah,
things.
it seems like it's definitely a mixed bag. And I guess it probably depends a lot also on like someone's consumption of, of the media they're really into. Like if you're watching sports constantly, you're probably not doing as much as you could with your own personal life. Or if you're on Instagram constantly, watching the reels of celebrities, then you're probably not doing as much in your own personal life. So I
Yeah.
guess it just kind of depends on what people are doing. But yeah, it's such a fascinating time because the world is changing so fast, and each, I mean, just every few years it seems like the social media landscape has shifted in another way. So
Absolutely. My students are all using an app called Be Real now.
oh, I've heard about that.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
just they've been using it for like a couple years, but I just heard about it where it is they're trying to, yeah, an alarm comes on and they have to take a picture right then, so it shows them sort of authentically. So it's interesting too that this generation that really grew up with social media is craving still the connection with other people,
yeah,
but wanting some of, they're recognizing how a lot of it is manufactured, and they're really curious about finding more authentic spaces online too. And
yeah.
there's always moral panic around. There were congressional hearings on comic books and how that was gonna ruin society. So I definitely, when people start being like social media is the end of the world, I'm like, is it?
Yes.
But the the issue is that it is, social media is built based on principles of persuasion and psychology, and
Yep.
it does, the beeps and the buzzes get us really easily sucked into it, and it's really hard for the reward systems in our brain to put down the phone without being really purposeful about it. So that is a big difference from the comic book wasn't buzzing in your pocket
Right.
to try to get you to look at it. So I think it is definitely a different ball of wax, but also, yeah, keeping in mind that this is every generation, things shift and they change, and we can't just sort of get panicked every single time, but we should think strategically and do research on it, and try to figure out, okay, what affects which types of audiences and why.
Sure. Yeah, I guess it just depends a lot on how we adapt as a society to the technology as it changes over time. I guess one thing that I've kind of wondered about. I'll be interested to get your opinion on this. When it comes to like the way that corporations influence influencers,
Mhm.
to sponsor, to promote their products or something like that. Because you alluded to several times how everything is carefully manufactured in the influencer space. You're always trying to show you know what you want people to see, um, and then when you get corporations, throwing the money at the influencers as being, major sources of income, then you have these influencers, kind of secretly almost, and in some ways, for a person who might not think too much about what someone's promoting and why, they might just be consuming this content, assuming that this is someone's personal, belief, when in reality, maybe they're getting paid, hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars to promote something on behalf of a company. What are your thoughts on that process, and how people deal with that going forward without being maybe potentially buying some product that isn't beneficial to them, but buying it because of that relationship with an influencer that they think they have, I guess.
Yeah, I barely go on TikTok because I am afraid I'll get addicted to it,
Okay.
but I just saw a news story about a TikTok influencer who apparently was, she had been paid to use a certain type of mascara and didn't disclose it. And now her fans are really, really mad at her.
Okay.
And so, even if it is all curated, thinking about there are costs,
Okay.
public
That's
relations
good.
costs and probably financial costs as far as numbers of views and clicks to being overly commercial. And
Yeah.
perhaps what drew people to certain influencers early was that they were less commercial, and then they get more followers, and there's more temptation to
Mm,
talk more products. So I think, as far as the influencer side of it, like it would behoove them from a business side to think about, okay, what is my audience like? Are they, accepting of a lot of, ads or not? And just to know that if you do try to trick them and they find out about it, in advertising research, this is called the persuasion knowledge model. And the more knowledge that an audience has that you are trying to persuade them, the more their guard is up, the more they're going to carefully scrutinize every bit of information or every action that
okay.
a brand takes or that an ad tells them. So that's a well documented media effect, is that the more aware you are that someone's trying to persuade you, the more skeptical you're going to be. Doesn't mean that you're not eventually going to buy the mascara.
Sure.
But you go to a car dealership, they're trying to sell you a car, but you need to buy a car. Like, I'm going to
Yep.
listen to the arguments about mileage and safety and yada, yada. So you can still be persuaded, but it's a lot harder if people are really aware that you're trying to persuade them. So there's a balance that needs to take place. And I do think, because we have new generations growing up with this, they do become more skeptical
Hmm.
of it and aware of it. And it's always going to ebb and flow. So now I think even if they get the idea about something from an influencer, they might check with their friends first. Hey, have you tried this mascara or this type of protein powder or this whatever thing I saw from an influencer. So it might actually start to swing back to the importance of peer networks, of known, like, smaller group peer networks. But it doesn't mean
Yeah.
you won't be getting ideas from ads you see
Sure.
online and from influencers.
But it's good to then that you're seeing lots of people, start to rally around the fact that, okay, this is obviously a promotion, a campaign to get me to buy something. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned big tech earlier, and another interesting part of that too is, as individuals, it takes a lot of effort for us to be like, wait a second, is this an ad? And to think about it and to talk to people. But there are policy options of ways lawmakers could require the big tech companies to make things a lot more obvious when they are ads. And since they do have such a monopoly, there are only a few big tech companies that control a lot of our information flow. It would make sense that they should, have to deal with some sort of regulations so
yeah,
that
one
we're,
would hope. Yeah,
yeah, not having to always be on guard.
sure. Yeah, it's an interesting world. I'll be curious to see how it continued to develops, and because I mean it's been a little weird at times to see how people, and so I guess the really famous ones in particular, almost stop being people but are rather just their own brand, and it's
Mhm.
kind of like this is odd, it's very strange. So uh,
Yeah.
hopefully
Yeah.
people get away from that, but we'll see.
Yeah.
So then I'm curious, what are you currently working on in terms of research?
Yeah, I mentioned doom scrolling earlier. We recently did a study, and I don't have any of the results yet, but we sat people down and participants in front of a screen of tweets that we had chosen because a previous group of participants had rated them all as very negative, very filled with doom. And we actually used an eye tracker that can see where people look
Oh
while they're
wow,
looking
okay.
at social media. And we're trying to figure out, okay, if you've spent some time doom scrolling, um, and you're then presented with what I would argue is civically important information, so like some news about local government or a health study, are you just so overloaded with negative you can't deal with that? Or does it sort of have you tuned in? Because anxiety can really focus your attention.
Sure.
And again, to this principle of media affect different people differently, before we brought them in, we had them take all these scales of sort of existing news consumption and anxiety tendencies. And so trying to see, okay, does our type of media diet, if it's heavily into this negative information, does that matter for all of us, or for only for people who are sort of um already having that personality trait of being attracted to more negative information, then does it prevent us from sort of grappling with important policy issues of the day? So I'm really interested in how one type of media actually sort of wears off or has carryover effects into our consumption of other type of media, and how I'm also interested in how celebrities, well, obviously they're in our social media feeds. We choose to follow them, and they're in news coverage. Um, but can they help us bridge information divides in society, because a lot of them are less politically radioactive? Sort of, we did some research on Tom Hanks when he came down with COVID. It actually got people from both sides of the aisles to consider, this might be an important issue. So thinking through that with regards to things like climate change. So not traditionally like really politically active celebrities,
Sure.
but other types of like influencers and celebrities can help educate people on policy information, even without trying to sway them one way or the other. So the ways we can kind of use the quote unquote attention economy to
Yeah.
get people more engaged in civics is really exciting to me.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a cool way of doing it, because there are, plenty of benefits, that influencers can bring to the table. So I just, yeah, you just want them
Yeah.
to promote, yeah, like, basic education on civic engagement versus conspiracy theories. That would be nice.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm always interested in memes too, and how we could
Yep.
potentially like subtly fill people in on current events through memes, because you have to understand what's going on to get the joke in the meme
True. Yeah.
often. So yeah, thinking about ways maybe we can even have memes for stress release, but also memes for maybe like high school news projects, things like that we can use popular culture in ways to sort of sneak in what I would call the vitamins of society, like public affairs and information like that into our media diets would be great.
Yeah. No, yeah, that would be awesome, because I think there's always more that we can learn in terms of getting more involved, and voting and everything else, all the factors that actually matter, beyond the cat video necessarily. There's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
it's
cat
good to have
videos
that
are
balance.
great, but yeah,
Yeah,
can we tag on to
the
those?
balance. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. And what's the best way for people to like keep track of your research and follow you and
Oh, that's a great question.
things?
I guess while it still exists, I'm on Twitter at
Yeah.
just Myrick. There's something called Google Scholar for people who don't know. You
Yep.
can go on Google Scholar and actually follow Jessica Gall Myrick, and that's where you see where my research is posted. Without, maybe there won't be as many memes as there are on Twitter.
That's where you influence people. And yeah.
Yeah, I try.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this information in a a space that just continues to be interesting and develop and impact everyone's lives. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, thanks for having me.